Obviously, you're very involved in the topic, but there are a lot of recent developments that are kind of dramatic for Ukraine. For example, recent ceasefire that it's just partially holding, and also the speed of Ukrainian reforms. And do you see any progress on both sides when it comes to the war and when it comes to reforms? And do you feel there is any progress?
I mean, in the case of the reform, there's clearly progress. Things aren't the same that they were a year ago. I think, one of the difficulties with revolutionary situations is that people's expectations are very high. And people expect things to change very fast. And, there are changes, and you do have new ministers, and I can see there are new policies and there are new kinds of people. But, I'm not sure that the people in charge have understood that without faster change, they're going to run into problems. In a way, your war against the Russians and your war against corruption are the same thing. An independent Ukraine has to be, if not totally free of corruption, it has to be a reliable state that people believe in and feel identity with and feel patriotic about. And if Ukraine is a weak, corrupt, state, then people won't feel that identity and they won't feel patriotic, and you'll have trouble winning the war. So that, people here often talk about them as if these are two separate problems. Actually, they're the same problem. I mean, creating a state and a society that people feel attached to is how you will win the war, and also how you will ultimately win the battle against corruption. So they're very connected, I think. And I think, in fact, the Ukrainian government has made a mistake in not fighting corruption and in not fighting for economic reform using this kind of language. I mean, this is really, the life or death of Ukraine is whether you can create a viable state and a place where people want to live, and a government that people want to work for and they want to pay taxes to. Nobody wants to pay taxes, but they'll pay taxes if they're getting something in exchange, and they feel,
Sure.
We're all living in this society together, and so we're all paying for our police forces and so on.
But speaking of, it's hard times, economics and politically, and war is going on. So speaking of that, some would say that there are populistic patterns are returning to the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian politicians. For example, anti-communist law, which is something that was heavily criticized by foreign partners and also inside the country.
I'm not that bothered by the anti-communist law. I mean,
why not?
It depends how it's played out and how it's used. But I mean, after World War II, Germany had a law against Nazi symbolism, and to this day, you can be arrested for having Nazi books in your house.
For example,
and it was, maybe it's now unnecessary, and but it doesn't strike me as being. At the time, it wasn't considered outrageous.
Do you find it too harsh? For example, in Germany, they have 2 years punishment.
I mean,
in Ukraine, 5.
I'm not saying it's. I don't know the details of it. I'm saying in principle, I don't see why you can't ban communist symbols if you want to for a while, if it's useful in creating a sense of cohesion. I mean, the risk of a law like that is that it becomes unenforceable. I mean, if you create a law that nobody will obey, then it's useless. So it may need to be adjusted for to be realistic. I mean, laws aren't gestures. You don't make a law to make a statement. I mean, law is the law, and people have to abide by it. And if people don't abide by it, then it doesn't work. And so, if you've written a law that's impossible to enforce, then that defeats the purpose.
Or otherwise, to use it as a political tool to persecute a specific people, like it has been done before.
That would be a disaster. So a law saying no communist symbols in public places, I don't really have a big problem with that. A law saying you go to jail for 5 years,
or banning ideology,
or you aren't allowed to and then it's used specifically to persecute opponents of the government. Yeah, that would be a disaster.
And
I don't think we know yet which one this is.
There is a lot of there is a lot of concern about communication between the government and the rest of the people, and many say that the government does not communicate a lot about reforms because they're doing some reforms and they're really busy with it. But at the same time, there is informational vacuum when it comes to people understand what they're doing or who's responsible for what. How do you feel? How do you think it's possible to overcome this communication gap?
I have a friend who works with some members of your government on communication, and I've talked to him about this. The main thing is for people to understand that communication is important. You have a generation of politicians here who aren't used to thinking that it matters. How you speak to people or how you explain to them. But actually, speaking to people is an art, and there are good ways to do it and bad ways to do it, and there are people who can advise you. But you have to be prepared to take the advice. I mean, it's no good sending people if you aren't prepared. You have to want, and you also have to understand that it's part of your job as a politician. Your job isn't just to do things and reform things and stop the war. Your job is to constantly be explaining to people who you are and what you're doing. And I'm not sure that Ukraine's politicians, all of them, yet understand that. I mean, it's actually a hard thing for British politicians to understand sometimes. So it's not. So that's creating a. It's also very important for Ukraine to begin to create a national narrative. Here's what we're all doing. Here's why we want it to happen.
And to embed it in communication strategy?
In communications, but also the idea that communications is PR or it's propaganda. This is wrong. Communications in a democracy is fundamental to politics. There is a communication between the government and the people who elected it, and the government owes them. Of course there are secrets and there are things that can't be said, and people have private conversations. Not everything has to be printed, but there has to be a constant explanation of what you're doing. That's part of your job, is to do that. And it's hard for politicians who aren't used to that kind of system to understand that. And I don't think they've quite understood it yet.
Do you think it takes time, or
it takes
more
time?
people?
It takes time, but it also takes an awareness that it's necessary. That it's and that it's a problem, and that I don't know. I don't know whether. I mean, I'm not. I've been here for less than 24 hours, so you'll have to give me another 3 hours to work this out. But
it's quite quick.
But no, I mean, I'm joking. But you know the answer to this better than I do. But have they understood yet that part of being a democratically elected politician is speaking, is transmitting what you're doing and explaining it to people? And I don't know that they've figured that out yet.